Hi everyone, Andrew here. I just want to take a moment to address a question that I get from clients. One of the most common goals that people have is they want to look better, and usually they want to do so by losing weight. And so I tend to recommend resistance training to everybody I work with, and it's about like 95% of what they do when they start working with me for like the first 6 months. And the question I get asked all the time is, well, if I want to lose weight, why am I doing resistance training? Why am I lifting weights? And so I want to take a moment to address that whole question. I'm going to give a very brief answer and then kind of overview of the points that I'm going to make, and then I'll go backtrack and go further into everything. So point number one is that if you want to look better, you need muscle mass on your body. Muscle is kind of what gives people that like aesthetic look. It's going to increase your metabolism then, which is going to help you lose fat. Resistance training is going to help your body increase the production of testosterone and other hormones that help build muscle and burn fat. And then through that, you're also, again, going to lose the weight you want to lose and maintain your muscle, which again helps you look good. And then the other half of this is, then why not do just cardio? And one, there's a low ceiling of improvement, which I'll talk about later. The orthopedic and hormonal stress on the body, so it's rough on your joints and on your endocrine system, your system that produces hormones. And then we'll talk a little bit about fuel utilization and fat storage efficiency, which is pretty complex, so I don't want to get too far into it right now, but again, we'll revisit that later. But that's basically a very brief overview of why resistance training is very important for weight loss. So backtracking. Resistance training, and you want to do this because it's going to help you build muscle. Muscle is what helps you look good, right? People say they want to be toned sometimes. That muscle tone is the amount of muscle that you see from underneath the layer of fat covering it. So yeah, you want to lose fat, but you also want to gain muscle. Otherwise, you're just going to look like skin and bones, and people generally tend to not want to look like that, right? People kind of want to have some muscle on them. And people tend to overestimate the amount of muscle that they have and the amount of muscle that they're going to gain. No one is going to look like a bodybuilder after like a year of training. So, while you're new to training, just aim for building as much muscle as possible. I can almost guarantee that you're not going to build too much muscle, and it's going to help you look better once this fat starts to come off, and it's going to help the fat come off as well. So it's not even a goal that runs contrary to the main goal. It's going to help it anyways. The way it helps is because you're going to, over time, if you build enough muscle mass, you're going to experience a permanent increase in your metabolism. Which is basically, you're going to burn more calories just sitting around doing nothing, or when you're exercising, or whatever it is you might be doing. Once you add a significant, and we're talking like 10 to 15 pounds here, once you add a significant amount of muscle mass to your body. That takes years, so it's not going to happen overnight or anything like that. It's not going to happen in 1 year, but over time it does give you a overall improved metabolism, which is going to help with the weight control. On top of that, resistance training is going to increase certain hormones that are anabolic. They help build muscle. And these hormones are testosterone. It's found primarily in males, but females also have testosterone in their bodies, and they need testosterone. HGH, which is human growth hormone, and then something called insulin growth factor 1, which is abbreviated as IGF-1. And they all basically help they all basically help build muscle and burn fat. They all play slightly different roles, but not different enough for us to really need a distinction in this conversation. They build muscle, they burn fat, and that's what they do. And these hormones increase in production when you do heavy, high-intensity resistance training. I want to take a moment and talk about another hormone called cortisol, which is basically a counterpart to the 3 anabolic hormones in that it's catabolic. So it helps break tissue down, basically. So cortisol is a stress hormone. Basically, in times of high stress, the body secretes it, and it's secreted by the adrenal glands, and it breaks down existing lean mass, muscle tissue, converts it into sugar, which can be used rapidly for energy. So about 200,000 years ago, when we were evolving, and when we were just basically didn't have any sort of modern technology whatsoever, we were under constant physical threats, like rival tribes, predators, stuff like that, and basically the body needed to be able to produce energy extremely quickly in order to survive those threats. And so the people who were able to do that survived those threats and passed on that ability, which there's a lot of factors that roll there, but cortisol is also one of those hormones that became prevalent in our genome because of that natural selection, basically. So The other aspect of that is that cortisol also prioritizes fat storage, because in times like starvation, when people couldn't get a lot of food, their bodies were basically like flooded with cortisol, which also prioritizes fat storage. So it allowed lean tissue to be converted to sugar, and then allowed that sugar to be converted to fat if it wasn't being burned off as energy in a survival, like fight or flight type situation. So nowadays, our body can't tell the difference between physical stress and emotional stress. So now, your boss is screaming at you, you have like a high stress, high pressure project at work, fighting with your spouse, kids acting up, stuff like that. It all stresses you out, and your body basically floods with cortisol. And cortisol, again, eats muscle and stores fat. That's basically what it does in a sentence. So why am I bringing this up right now? Well, cortisol is basically always prevalent in your lives, and when you do resistance training, it does increase temporarily along with those anabolic hormones. But once you stop the resistance training, once you stop that stress, the cortisol production goes back down, and the anabolic hormones stay elevated for like 24 to 48 hours following that. So basically, resistance training results in a temporary, but if you do it often enough, it's generally like permanent increase in those anabolic hormones that help build muscle and burn fat. Now, that kind of covers why resistance training is helpful in helping you achieve weight loss and your body composition goals. So now I want to take a moment and go over why just doing cardio training is not as beneficial as most people would think. So I have no problem with doing conditioning or incorporating cardio into a good resistance training program, but by no means should cardio be the only aspect of your weight loss program, and here's why. One is a low ceiling of improvement. Basically, you take the average untrained runner, you can turn them into a pretty good runner within maybe like a year or two. You take the average untrained person with regards to resistance training, they can still be making progress 5 or 6 years into training, and even beyond that, it just gets a little trickier to have them make progress. But there are a lot of variables you can manipulate with resistance training, like which exercise you're doing, adding weight, adding sets, adding reps, changing the order in which you do things, changing the movements that they're paired with, just making variations tougher. For example, adding pauses into your reps, stuff like that. Just other advanced rep methods, or substituting just like less common methods. For example, turning a back squat into a front squat. You could progress that to an overhead squat or something called a Zercher squat. They're all squats, but they're all different variations, and it's very difficult to master any single one of them, let alone all four. So there's always something to be learned with resistance training. There's always another area that you can improve upon. With running and other traditional cardio type training, the ceiling tends to be lower. There's less room for mastery. People tend to approach their personal ceiling a little quicker. I'm not saying everyone's going to master, how to run or how to bike or how to row, stuff like that. But people will tend to reach their own personal plateau a little sooner. And another thing is, especially with regards to running, the only way to get better is just to add more miles, and the body can't take that. It's very stressful on the body, which kind of brings me to my second point, which is orthopedic and hormonal stress. So orthopedic just means in relation to the joints. Basically, running is very hard on your joints. People tend to know that. I don't think people know quite how far it goes. So things like plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendonitis, IT band syndrome, shin splints, these are all like overuse injuries. And while none of them are seriously or terribly serious on their own, they tend to be chronic, and they tend to feed other injuries. So if you have an issue with your left ankle over time and you keep running on it, it can mess up your right knee, which over time will mess up your left hip. Injuries kind of tend to like ping pong back and forth across the body as they work their way up. It's just there's a whole concept behind that. I don't want to get too far into it, but that's basically how injuries tend to work. And running actually has the highest injury rate out of any other sport, more than like football, more than hockey, more than weightlifting, more than CrossFit, more than any of that stuff. So again, the injuries aren't that serious, but they're very common, and they tend to stick around for a long time, and they can cause other injuries further down the road. So it's not really a path that you want to get started on. The other type of stress that I talked about was hormonal stress, which is basically stress on your endocrine system, which is the system that produces hormones in the body. Over a long time, long distance, long duration running, so like running like 5 miles, every day and stuff like that. That basically, one, during a long run, your body's going to produce more cortisol, more of that muscle-eating, fat-storing hormone that I just talked about. Two is that over long periods of time, it impairs the function of certain glands, like the adrenal glands, and among others. And this also basically results in reduced production of those good anabolic hormones that we talked about. So you're increasing your body's ability to produce hormones that build muscle or that eat muscle and store fat, and you're decreasing your body's ability to produce the hormones that build muscle and burn fat. So it's kind of a double whammy there. And adding an occasional run on top of a lifting session is totally fine. Just when all you do is run, you are priming your body up to secrete the types of hormones that you don't want and to limit the production of hormones that you do want prevalent in your body. And the last one is very complex, but I'm going to try to explain this pretty simply. So this refers to fuel utilization and just efficiency in using that fuel. There are three main types of fuel sources that the human body runs off of: carbs, fats, and proteins. Proteins are not a good choice for fuel for two reasons. One, you want them to build muscle and to build and repair existing tissue in the body, existing cells basically, whether, especially muscle, but other as well, like skin and nails and stuff like that. The other reason is that protein's a very inefficient fuel source. So you don't get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak. Carbohydrates and fat, on the other hand, tend to be very efficient fuel sources. The body uses fat anywhere from at rest, like sitting in a chair or sleeping, up to light to moderate intensity exercise, from basically about like 50 to 85% of your max heart rate. Carbohydrates come into play more as you reach higher intensities, so things like sprinting, heavy lifting, stuff like that. Anything where it's high intensity, that's where carbohydrates start to play a more predominant role. And it's not like you just burn just fat or just carbohydrates. It's on like a sliding continuum, one or the other. So like if you're sitting, you might be burning like 90% fat, 10% carbohydrates. If you're at an all-out sprint, you might be burning 90% carbohydrates. If you're somewhere in the middle, it might be like a 60-40 split or something like that. So it kind of just depends on the type of activity you're doing and just your own individual like biochemistry. But that's basically fuel utilization. And so things like diabetes and insulin resistance and high blood sugar and stuff like that, which are all pretty much the same thing, and metabolic syndrome, which is a little more complicated. It's the presence of a couple other symptoms, one of which could be high blood sugar or diabetes. But all that stuff basically revolves around the body's inability is a good word, to use carbohydrates at all or use them efficiently as a fuel source. And then when that happens, the body can't use carbohydrates as a fuel. They stack up in the blood, hence the high blood sugar, and then they tend to get stored as fat then, because you can't just keep pumping sugar into the bloodstream, right? You would eventually go into a coma. So the sugar has to go somewhere, and since it can't be used as energy by the cells, it has to be stored as fat. So So carbohydrates are a kind of underused fuel source, whereas you use fat all the time when you're resting or at light to moderate activity. So resistance training teaches your body how to use carbohydrates efficiently, which means that you've basically broadened or diversified your body's ability to use fuel sources, which is good, because then the carbohydrates are being used for energy instead of being stored as fat. So the other thing is that when your body is very efficient at using fat as a fuel, for example, like in people who run all the time, they're always in that low to moderate intensity zone, that fat burning zone on the treadmill. That's their body's very good at using fat as a fuel. So two things happen. One is that the body tends to store more fat because it knows it's going to need to use that fat for fuel. And two is that as you get more efficient at using fat as a fuel, you use less fat, right? Think about like a car. Right? Cars that are very fuel efficient travel very far and very little gasoline. People who are very efficient at fat utilization, they get very far on a relatively small amount of fat. And when you're using less fat, then you're not accomplishing the thing that you set out to do by running in the first place. And the other thing is that with regards to the fat burning zone on the treadmill, while physiologically it's true, because we talked about you use more fat at lower intensities, it doesn't account for the fact that at higher intensities you burn more calories anyway, so you're probably burning almost as much fat in total at high intensities as you would at lower intensity, and you're burning a greater amount of carbohydrates. Basically, you're burning more calories in general when you exercise at higher intensities, and you get an increase in your metabolism. That afterburn effect that they kind of talk about, that's what that is, where your body uses nutrients for a longer period of time following the exercise. So for those reasons, the fat burning zone on a treadmill is kind of misunderstood. So yeah, you're using more fat during the exercise, a greater proportion of fat during the exercise, but the amount of calories you burn overall is likely less, and the amount of calories your body's going to burn afterwards is also likely less. And remember that once it's in the body, a calorie is a calorie. So just because you're using more fat calories now doesn't, during the low intensity exercise, doesn't mean that your body is not going to take carbohydrates that have been used and store them as fat. So again, the body's very good at kind of like compensating and cutting corners, and that's another way that it does that. So again, if you don't resistance train and pretty much only run or only do cardio, then you are teaching your body to use fat as a fuel efficiently, which means that it won't use carbohydrates efficiently, which means that it'll want to store those carbohydrates as fat, and you also prime your body up to store more fat in general because it knows that it's going to need fat as a fuel. If you look at marathoners and stuff like that, they tend, none of them are very few of them are like overweight or anything, but none of them are also really lean and muscular, and that's because their bodies, they don't produce as many of those hormones that help build muscle. Their bodies are high in cortisol. They're subjected to a lot of that hormonal stress, and that basically makes their bodies break down muscle for energy and prioritize fat storage. And they prioritize fat storage as well because they need to be efficient in fat utilization, and they need huge fuel reserves to fuel their activities, their marathon. There's a saying in exercise physiology that form follows function. Basically, the shape that your body takes is dictated by the activities you do. And so if you do activities that necessitate the breakdown of muscle and the storage of fat, that which is running and other long duration cardio, that's the way your body's going to look. But I'm not saying not to do this. Again, I'm not saying never to do conditioning or cardio. I'm just saying you need to make the base of your training resistance training, lifting weights, and then supplement that with your cardio training, and you're going to get much better results. Whether it's weight loss or whatever you might be looking for, you're going to get much better results from incorporating frequent heavy resistance training. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Feel free to post or ask directly, whatever you feel like doing. So thank you for listening.